This is the first of two videos in which we'll be looking at the third major section of the Hebrew Old Testament called the Writings. This third section of the Hebrew Old Testament is called the Writings, or in Hebrew the word is ketuvim, and this is everything else that doesn't fit into the Torah or the prophets. These books are not always printed in the same order in Hebrew Bibles, but they do include all of the following books: Psalms, Proverbs, Job, the five scrolls, we'll get to what that means in a moment, Daniel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah. Talk about the writings, and this is a good place to talk about the idea of pseudonymous authorship. What's meant by this word pseudonymous authorship is like a pen name. Like, for example, the great American writer Mark Twain that was a pen name. His real name was Samuel Clemens, so he wrote under a different name. But in the ancient world, it happened a little bit differently. What would happen is some relatively unknown figure would write a book or a text in the name of some better known or very well known figure from the past. So examples of this in the Old Testament are the books of Psalms and Proverbs. Many of the Psalms are attributed to David. That doesn't necessarily mean that King David was himself the one who wrote the poems. It's not completely out of the realm of possibility that David wrote these things or many other poems like it, but something that might have been happening is that a faithful poet in Israel could have been writing in the name of King David to give a little bit more authority to what he or she was writing. The book of Psalms, the Hebrew title is Tehillim, or praises. This gives an example of how to praise God even in the darkest times of life. The Psalms were often used in Jewish worship in the temple, and they give something of a very wide range of emotions, from wonderful trust and assurance in something like Psalm 23, which begins with "The Lord is my shepherd," to tremendous despair, something like Psalm 88, in which the poet complains that God has even made his lovers and his friends abandon him, and his only companion is darkness. One challenge that you might want to take up is to read the entire book of Psalms in 40 days. And you might say, well, how can I do that? How can I read something so long in so short a time? Well, actually, it's quite simple. You simply just need to read 4 Psalms per day for 30 days, which equals 120, and then read 3 Psalms per day for the final 10 days of your 40 days, which equals 30. 120 plus 30 equals 150, and you've read the entire book of Psalms. And you could even do this with the really long Psalm 119 with its 176 verses, because when you look at it, you see that this really long psalm, the longest by far, is surrounded by relatively short psalms. Psalms 117, 118, and 120, these would be the ones that you would read on the same day as Psalm 119, only total 40 verses between the 3 of them. The book of Proverbs is a little bit different from Psalms. It's kind of secular in its theology. I mean, normally use the word secular nowadays to mean God-denying or worldly in a bad sense, but it wouldn't have been possible in the ancient world to deny the existence of God or the gods. But Proverbs is secular, worldly, wise kinds of ideas, practical instruction for how to live life. It might have originally been connected to how to live life in the royal court, but it really is good instruction for how to live life anywhere. This is something like the collected wisdom of the people that most of the time, more often than not, when you do X, Y is the result. So, for example, we take Proverbs 22:6, which says, "Train up a child in the way it should go, and when it is old, it will not depart from it." Well, most of the time that's true, but certainly some people have the experience where they did train up their children in the way they should go, but various experiences turned the children even away from the true faith. That's very sad when that happens, but most of the time, more often than not, it doesn't happen that way. In ancient Israel, there was a movement called the wisdom theology, and these are the kinds of things that wisdom theology taught, that if you do good, good will result. God will bless you in response to the good that you have done, and the suffering or disease or trouble that you have in your life is the result of something bad that you have done. When we look at something like the book of Job, this is tries to, at least in a way, tries to overturn this idea. Job is a sustained argument, a reflection on the justice of God, the reality that sometimes faithful people suffer. And usually the book of Job is written as it's turning over this basic idea of wisdom theology. Wisdom theology has the idea that if you do good, you will be blessed, and if you do evil, you will be cursed. But if we read the book of Job closely, we'll see that the main character, Job is the one who has all this unjust suffering inflicted on him. He loses all his property, his children die, his health is brought to the very brink of his death. But Job never really questions the basic idea that if you do good, you will be rewarded, and if you do evil, you will be punished. He just says that this idea isn't really big enough to describe all of experience. And actually, when I read the book of Job, I think it illustrates something that I like to call the Eliphaz fallacy. In logic, there's a fallacy known as affirming the consequent. And what this means is to look at the backside of a causal statement. Something like, for example, if it rains, the streets will get wet. No, that makes sense, right? Sure. But the fallacy comes in when you say, turn that around and say, the streets are wet, therefore it must be raining. But the problem is that there are many possible explanations for why the streets might be wet, not just rain. If it rains, the streets will get wet, sure enough. But if the streets are wet, that doesn't necessarily mean it's raining. So Job, when he's arguing with Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, what they say is all four of them share the idea that if you do good, you will be blessed by God. And if you do evil, you will be cursed by God. But what Job says to the friends is that you are turning this over and looking at it at the backside, and that's not right. They are saying, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are saying to Job, you are being cursed, therefore you must have sinned. And Job says, that idea is not big enough for my experience because, in fact, I have not sinned. And the narrator tells us once in chapter 1, and God tells us twice, once in chapter 1 and once in chapter 2, that Job is blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. Job has, in fact, not sinned. So, just like when the streets are wet, we look not only to the possibility that it's raining, but we look to other potential causes of why the streets will be wet. In the book of Job, we look not just to the sin that might have brought about Job's suffering, but we look at to other possible causes. And the book of Job is this reflection on unjust suffering. Job doesn't deserve what he has gotten, but still Job remains faithful, and he is ultimately rewarded at the end. And then we turn to something called the Five Scrolls. It's a collection of 5 books that were read at particular times, or in even today are read at particular times in the Jewish calendar. These are Ecclesiastes, Esther, Song of Songs, Ruth, and Lamentations. Ecclesiastes is usually read at the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tents, or temporary shelters. This was a time when Jews throughout the world will commemorate the time when their ancestors were living in the desert, and they'll even move outside of their house into the yard or onto the balcony or something like that, and live outside of their house for a week. Esther was read at the time, or is read at the festival of Purim, which describes yet another deliverance of God, another time when God delivered the Jews from imminent destruction. And it's often said that Jewish holidays have 3 steps. First step is somebody tried to kill us, and the second step is we won, and the third step is let's eat. Song of Songs is often read at the Feast of the Passover, which describes God's deep love for the children of Israel in sparing them from the destruction of the firstborn sons which he brought through the land of Egypt. And the book of Ruth is read at a related holiday, the Feast of Pentecost, which was the celebration of God's giving of the law, but it also was connected to the barley harvest. And the great story of deliverance of the book of Ruth takes place, the story says it takes place at the time of the barley harvest, and ultimately issued in the birth of King David, who, if Ruth had not been faithful to leave her family and her gods back in Moab, then there would have been no King David. And of all of the 5 scrolls, the one that's least happy, or in fact the one that is very, very sad, is the book of Lamentations. It says, traditionally ascribed to the prophet Jeremiah, because he has a lot of laments in his book as well, but again, we're dealing with pseudonymous writing there. But Lamentations is read at the fast of the 9th of Av. This is the 9th day of the month Av in the Jewish calendar. And according to tradition, this is the time when the temple was destroyed by the Babylonian army. And although Jeremiah says, and others, Ezekiel, say that this was at the will of the Lord, nevertheless, it is still a time for great weeping, great, really, lamentation for the destruction of the temple and the suffering that represents. And the Hebrew title of the book of Lamentations really drives this home. It sounds like a cry out in terror. The title in Hebrew is Eka. If you say that in the right way, you can hear the great terror, the great sadness that is coming in there. This first set of the writings section that we've looked at in this video covers a range of materials from the very long book of Psalms to the short but very, very sad, very painful book of Lamentations. Very, very good emotions are found here, and also very bad emotions are found here. philosophical and theological reflection is found here, but also practical day-to-day steps for virtuous living. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.